up in the spare room here at Wellspring and leaning into Abel, and we're talking about bless, and specifically we're talking about justice and mercy.
For sure.
Let's try and sort of situate that in the scriptures.
Yeah, for sure. I just think as for us and thinking about the storyline of scripture.
Let me guess. Genesis 1.
Totally, right? So, I mean, Genesis 1 and 2, God creates a good and just world,
Yeah.
right? There's no sin, there's no disease, there's no injustice.
Yeah.
And God is depicted as this just and generous God who invites humans and calls them, made in his image, to rule on his behalf, and again, to carry out his mission and his character out in the world.
Yeah.
In particular, that phrase, made in the image of God, is really crucial and key to this discussion, because what that means, among other things, is that each human being, regardless of age, gender, race, all that sort of stuff, has dignity, value, worth, and is to be treated as such.
Which is a big deal, because in the ancient Near East, right, that would have primarily just been applied to a king.
To a king, and maybe
now,
if you're super wealthy, right?
But this is like this massive democratizing
Exactly,
of dignity.
For sure.
Which is like pretty, I don't know, fresh on the scene with the Hebrew scriptures.
For sure, right? And even like applying that to our culture right now, all the values as far as equality and justice come from image of God. They come from Genesis 1. You can look up, a lot of atheists even would agree with that point. But I think what's really key here is that human beings made in God's image are to be this, to treat each other as such. What happens post-Genesis 3 after Adam and Eve fall into temptation is you have Genesis 4, the first murder. Cain and Abel.
The first story, east of Eden, is a picture of injustice and violence.
Exactly. We're not humans, Cain and Abel, or Cain in particular, treating his brother Abel as an image bearer of God. And this only just spiraled out of control as you read the rest of the narrative.
Violence gets worse and worse until the flood.
Till the flood, and that's exactly Genesis 6. What grieves the heart of God is that now, instead of image bearers blessing and filling God's world with shalom,
his image.
What fills the earth is the language of Genesis 6 is violence, and it grieves God's heart. So you have the story of the flood, and then post that, God responds with this plan through one family to bring blessing back to the world. The family of Abraham, right?
But he introduces these concepts of justice and righteousness at that point.
At that point,
and tzedakah, which are really important Hebrew terms.
For sure. So in Genesis 18, the first time we see this pairing is Genesis 18, verse 19, is that God says, I've chosen Abraham and his family to keep the way of the Lord by doing two things, righteousness and justice, tzedakah and mishpat. Twin pairing you see all throughout.
They're used all the time, and often we think of it as like personal righteousness, but there's this very interesting play between these two.
And I think importantly to talk about biblically, righteousness means community life with all relationships, with God, others, self, and creation that's well ordered, full of shalom, the Hebrew word for peace, where all things are flourishing as God designed them to be.
So there's an ordering, living into that order relationally, which leads to peace and flourishing.
Exactly. And a righteous person then is one who contributes to such life.
Okay.
On the kind of the flip side, or the other pairing of that word, justice, doing justice, one way to describe it, is inconveniencing yourself for the sake of the other. In particular, in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the worthless person, or the one that's low on the societal totem pole, if you will. So like the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the poor. Kind of those four become like the big four that the Hebrew prophets in particular really call Israel to do justice towards.
So sort of the frame of justice in that sort of sense is to actually advocate for the flourishing of the marginalized or those who might be suffering or struggling in that context.
Exactly. And in context here, in particular, the family of Abraham, Genesis 18, is called to be this kind of family that does righteousness and justice.
And this is like the calling, right? He becomes the head of the family.
Exactly, totally.
So this is a really big deal to say, hey, this is what you should be about.
For sure, exactly. And so as God rescues this family out of slavery, out of injustice, by the way, God brings Israel to the foot of Mount Sinai, and as part of that...
So he frees them from slavery in Egypt.
In Egypt, yes, exactly. So under injustice from Pharaoh, delivers them out of slavery, brings them to the foot of the mountain, Mount Sinai, and there gives them his law, his Torah, his instruction. And a huge key part of that Torah or instruction is provisions and guidelines and instructions to do exactly this, righteousness and justice.
Which is interesting, right? Because we often skip over this. But there's some pretty radical provisions.
100%.
Right? Caring for the marginalized, the foreigner, the widow, those who are powerless. There's even the Jubilee, right? Where it's like every 50 years, it's like, basically redistribute land and stuff so that
Yes.
people have what they need and all slaves are set free.
For sure, exactly. And when you really spend time looking at the Hebrew law, or the law, which is great bedtime reading, but when you actually take time to look at it and really kind of do a little bit of study, it takes a little bit of work, but do some study, you begin to see like exactly what you're saying, the radical nature of what God was advocating Israel to be, a community that was very, if I might say it like this, progressive as far as their justice in society and the way that they treated the vulnerable populations in their communities.
And yet, it seems to me, from what I can tell, Israel never practiced the Jubilee.
Yeah.
And they neglected a lot of these practices of righteousness and justice,
For sure.
which leads to exile. And the prophets say a lot. I remember Isaiah says this, Isaiah 58, 5-6. Is not this the fast that I chose to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry?
Yeah, for sure. And that just echoes and repeated. That's one of the key things that you read the biblical prophets. They're constantly railing against Israel's leaders and the people themselves for their lack of doing tzedakah and mishpat in society. And so what ends up happening then, like you mentioned, Israel goes off into exile. There's, again, this longing and anticipation for God to redeem and rescue his people, that they might experience right, good rulership under himself, Yahweh, where he does as king tzedakah and mishpat himself. And so Jesus comes onto the scene, fulfilling this promise, fulfilling this hope from the Hebrew prophets, to the point where kind of his first public sermon or speech, if you will, Luke 4, Isaiah, or Jesus quotes from Isaiah, Isaiah 61, which is referencing back to what you mentioned a moment ago, the Jubilee year, right? Isaiah 61.
Sort of initiating this Jubilee sense of freedom and end of oppression and
proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's direct Jubilee language from the Torah, from the Old Testament. And in particular, you read and study the life and ministry of Jesus, especially in Luke's gospel. All of the sort of, we might consider justice language is really kind of amped up and brought to the surface.
And the story of the Good Samaritan.
Exactly.
What does it look like to love our neighbor, right? To have mercy.
For sure. Totally. And so when Jesus is kind of forming his disciples, kind of calling people to follow him, a key fundamental part of that is becoming the kind of person who, like Jesus, does righteousness and justice, especially in those moments and places where there's vulnerable people that are facing
and that's
oppression.
part of what Jesus means when he says to love your neighbor.
Totally, And I think, again, you mentioned the Good Samaritan story. You read that whole story in context. That's not just like, a fun verse to memorize or make me feel good.
It's a radically challenging story.
Totally, for sure. And even to the point later when Paul in Ephesians 2 talks about we are saved by grace through faith, it's not of our own doing, so that we might do good works, he later goes on to say. And so a lot of biblical scholars point out that phrase or that moniker, good works, in the New Testament, in the Pauline literature, is really shorthand for care for the poor. And so there's all these other examples and the ways that phrase is used.
That's not something Paul didn't care about.
Exactly. That was a key fundamental theme for him. Galatians 2, he talks about the one thing he was eager to do was care for the poor. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, we've talked about this a little bit too, is that Paul is calling the church in Corinth to care for the church in Jerusalem that was financially poor.
Clearly, and then James riffs on this.
James riffs on this, totally. So James talks about in James 3 about, you show favoritism to the wealthy and the rich in your gathering, but then you neglect the poor. That's not what Jesus has called us to do. And so there's all that sort of imagery and stuff at play as well. But really, as you kind of keep working through the New Testament, you can't get away from this call to be a person of justice. It's just embedded into what it means to be a disciple of Jesus.
So then what does that look like as we shift to our lives in a culture where virtue signaling is like a very real thing? Maybe you can define that.
Sure,
where you sort of like, you want to post something. And so that you seem like you're just. When in reality, you might just be posting something as a way of saying, I care about these things, but you're not really doing anything.
For sure. Yeah. And I think what's really key here is that we live in this really interesting moment where there is this pull and this tension to want to maybe showcase publicly, your advocacy for X, Y, and Z, which probably isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Some of those causes are good.
Really good and really important that Jesus followers should, jump on to a certain degree. But at the same time, the call of Scripture, the call of Jesus, is also to become the kind of person that is just.
Yeah.
That where Jesus talks about the transformation of our heart,
Yeah.
our character, our virtue, like who we are from the inside out.
So this is
really
the
matters.
righteousness and justice.
They go
Yeah.
together, and I think sometimes in our cultural moment we have to be careful of just kind of outwardly showcasing, oh, I'm on the right team or I have the right cause, without actually paying attention to our own hearts, our motives, how we actually treat people that maybe aren't doing the right cause might be an indicator of where our hearts might be. And I think when we're talking about biblical justice, we want to, yes, do the right thing, but also become the right person, right people at the same time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stands out to me is, especially living in Pacific Grove, how easy it is to sort of forget that like this world can be a really unjust place.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? It's beautiful, nice houses, and you realize like, I've forgotten that there's a whole world out there that God cares about.
For
and
sure.
maybe I should care about.
Totally.
And I think part of the call, at least for me, for justice, living in PG, is to pay attention to, one, the places of pain. So where are the places of pain or injustice in my world that I see or maybe don't see?
For sure.
And then also, like, what's going on outside of this space?
Yeah.
What are causes that God might care about? Maybe I can read the newspaper in a different way. Maybe I can pay attention, go out of my normal rhythms in order to be exposed to real problems in the world and allow myself to be touched or affected by that.
For sure. And I think as we're thinking about this and living this out practically, we're recognizing that, number one, we're anticipating a day when God will take away all the injustice and all of the pain and all of the selfishness that we have done as humans and in the new creation. And at the same time, right here, right now, we get to embody that as Jesus did for us. And becoming,
we get to anticipate the kingdom, the justice of the kingdom in our actions today.
For sure, And it's a really important call, and I think it's vital for us as disciples of Jesus to lean into that. So.
What if you were to give like a couple practical or one practical tip, what would you say?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things real briefly, is that I've kind of already alluded to this, but becoming the kind of person that embodies justice, character matters for sure. So this is getting at this idea where we're not just doing a whole bunch of things just to check them off or to advocate for certain causes. That's important, but also paying attention to our heart. Mark Sayers has this line where often in our culture we want the kingdom without the king, which it's a shorthand way of getting at we want to do all the right justice causes without Jesus in the mix. And I think as followers of Jesus, it sounds so simple, is keeping Jesus at the forefront of our minds and of our idea of what it means to become the kinds of people that do justice.
That's good.
I think also too, like exactly what you're saying, is paying attention to what else is happening in the world. I think it's really easy to just focus in on my own story, my own life, my own problems, and there's a place for that. That's important. But I think being very intentional, whether that is, reading the news, expanding your horizon a little bit about that. Obviously, there's practices with that as well that you need to pay attention to. But really being intentional. What does it look like for you to kind of expand sort of your bubble, if you will, as far as what else is happening out in the world, and praying into that. God, there's that old song we sometimes sing growing up in the church, break my heart for what breaks yours. And it's becoming that kind of person where God is grieved, like Genesis 6, by the violence that's happening before the flood. And God grieves over injustice in our world today too. And it's praying into that. God, break my heart for what is really breaking your heart, and let me live into that.
I think there's that multiple components. It's like willingness to see, right? There's, in the story of the Good Samaritan, there's the first two, the priest and the Levite cross the other side. Like, are you willing to see? The first thing he does is he sees, and then he has compassion.
For sure,
So are we willing to see and then be affected
by that,
by the pain and injustice in the world? Two, are we willing to respond to it, either in prayer or in action? And I think we should all have some injustice that we're aware of in the world, that we're praying for, that we're aware of, that we're giving money to, that we're contributing to.
For sure. That's really good.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Yep.